Chapter 41. Nero played and sang, in honor of the Lady of Cyprus, a hymn the verses and music of which were composed by himself. That day he was in voice, and felt that his music really captivated those present. That feeling added such power to the sounds produced and roused his own soul so much that he seemed inspired. At last he grew pale from genuine emotion. This was surely the first time that he had no desire to hear praises from others. He sat for a time with his hands on the sthara and with bowed head. Then, rising suddenly, he said, I am tired and need air. Meanwhile ye will tune the sthara. He covered his throat then with a silk kerchief. Ye will go with me, said he, turning to Petronius and Vinicius, who were sitting in a corner of the hall. Give me thy arm, Vinicius, for strength fails me. Petronius will talk to me of music. They went out on the terrace, which was paved with alabaster and sprinkled with saffron. Here one can breathe more freely, said Nero. My soul is moved and sad, though I see that with what I have sung to thee on trial just now I may appear in public, and my triumph will be such as no Roman has ever achieved. Thou mayst appear here, in Rome, in Achaia. I admire thee with my whole heart and mind, divinity, answered Petronius. I know thou art too slothful to force thyself to flattery, and thou art as sincere as Tullius Seneca, but thou hast more knowledge than he. Tell me, what is thy judgment on music? When I listen to poetry, when I look at a quadriga directed by thee in the circus, when I look at a beautiful statue, temple, or picture, I feel that I comprehend perfectly what I see, that my enthusiasm takes in all that these can give. But when I listen to music, especially thy music, new delights and beauties open before me every instant. I pursue them, I try to seize them, but before I can take them to myself, new and newer ones flow in, just like waves of the sea, which roll on from infinity. Hence I tell thee that music is like the sea. We stand on one shore and gaze at remoteness, but we cannot see the other shore. Ah, what deep knowledge thou hast, said Nero, and they walked on for a moment, only the slight sound of the saffron leaves under their feet being heard. Thou hast expressed my idea, said Nero at last, hence I say now, as ever, in all Rome thou art the only man able to understand me. Thus it is, my judgment of music is the same as thine. When I play and sing, I see things which I did not know as existing in my dominions or in the world. I am Caesar, and the world is mine. I can do everything. But music opens new kingdoms to me, new mountains, new seas, new delights unknown before. Most frequently I cannot name them or grasp them, I only feel them. I feel the gods, I see Olympus. Some kind of breeze from beyond the earth blows in on me. I behold, as in a mist, certain immeasurable greatnesses, but calm and bright as sunshine. The whole Spheros plays around me, and I declare to thee, here Nero's voice quivered with genuine wonder, that I, Caesar and God, feel at such times as diminutive as dust. Wilt thou believe this? I will. Only great artists have power to feel small in the presence of art. This is a night of sincerity, hence I open my soul to thee as to a friend. And I will say more. Dost thou consider that I am blind or deprived of reason? Dost thou think that I am ignorant of this, that people in Rome write insults on the walls against me, call me a matricide, a wife murderer, hold me a monster and a tyrant, because Tigellinus obtained a few sentences of death against my enemies? Yes, my dear, they hold me a monster, and I know it. They have talked cruelty on me to that degree that at times I put the question to myself, am I not cruel? But they do not understand this, that a man's deeds may be cruel at times while he himself is not cruel. Ah, no one will believe, and perhaps even thou, my dear, wilt not believe, that at moments when music caresses my soul I feel as kind as a child in the cradle. I swear by those stars which shine above us, that I speak the pure truth to thee. People do not know how much goodness lies in this heart, and what treasures I see in it when music opens the door to them. Petronius, who had not the least doubt that Nero was speaking sincerely at that moment, and that music might bring out various more noble inclinations of his soul, which were overwhelmed by mountains of egotism, profligacy, and crime, said, men should know thee as nearly as I do. Rome has never been able to appreciate thee. Caesar leaned more heavily on Vinicius's arm, as if he were bending under the weight of injustice, and answered, Tigellinus has told me that in the Senate they whisper into one another's ears that Diodorus and Terpnos play on the sthara better than I. They refuse me even that. But tell me, thou who art truthful always, do they play better, or as well? By no means. Thy touch is finer, and has greater power. In thee the artist is evident, in them the expert. The man who hears their music first understands better what thou art. If that be true, let them live. They will never imagine what a service thou hast rendered them in this moment. For that matter, if I had condemned those two, I should have had to take others in place of them. And people would say, besides, that out of love for music thou destroyest music in thy dominions. Never kill art for art's sake, O divinity. How different thou art from Tigellinus, answered Nero. But sayest thou, I am an artist in everything, and since music opens for me spaces the existence of which I had not divined, regions which I do not possess, delight and happiness which I do not know, I cannot live a common life. Music tells me that the uncommon exists, so I seek it with all the power of dominion which the gods have placed in my hands. At times it seems to me that to reach those Olympian worlds I must do something which no man has done hitherto. I must surpass the stature of man in good or evil. I know that people declare me mad. But I am not mad, I am only seeking. And if I am going mad, it is out of disgust and impatience that I cannot find. I am seeking. Dost understand me? And therefore I wish to be greater than man. For only in that way can I be the greatest as an artist. Here he lowered his voice so that Vinicius could not hear him, and, putting his mouth to the ear of Petronius, he whispered, Dost know that I condemned my mother and wife to death mainly because I wished to lay at the gate of an unknown world the greatest sacrifice that man could put there? I thought that afterward something would happen, that doors would be opened beyond which I should see something unknown. Let it be wonderful or awful, surpassing human conception, if only great and uncommon. But that sacrifice was not sufficient. To open the Empyrean doors it is evident that something greater is needed, and let it be given as the fates desire. What dost thou intend to do? Thou shalt see sooner than thou thinkest. Meanwhile be assured that there are two Neros, one such as people know, the other an artist, whom thou alone knowest, and if he slays as does death, or is in frenzy like Bacchus, it is only because the flatness and misery of common life stifle him, and I should like to destroy them, though I had to use fire or iron. Oh, how flat this world will be when I am gone from it. No man has suspected yet, not thou even, what an artist I am. But precisely because of this I suffer, and sincerely do I tell thee that the soul in me is as gloomy as those cypresses which stand dark there in front of us. It is grievous for a man to bear at once the weight of supreme power and the highest talents. I sympathize with thee, O Caesar, and with me earth and sea, not counting Vinicius, who deifies thee in his soul. He, too, has always been dear to me, said Caesar, though he serves Mars, not the Muses. He serves Aphrodite first of all, answered Petronius. And suddenly he determined to settle the affair of his nephew at a blow, and at the same time to eliminate every danger which might threaten him. He is in love, as was Troilus with Cressida. Permit him, Lord, to visit Rome, for he is dying on my hands. Dost thou know that that Lygian hostage whom thou gavest him has been found, and Vinicius, when leaving for Antium, left her in care of a certain Linus? I did not mention this to thee, for thou wert composing thy hymn, and that was more important than all besides. Vinicius wanted her as a mistress, but when she turned out to be as virtuous as Lucretia, he fell in love with her virtue, and now his desire is to marry her. She is a king's daughter, hence she will cause him no detriment, but he is a real soldier. He sighs and withers and groans, but he is waiting for the permission of his imperator. The imperator does not choose wives for his soldiers. What good is my permission to Vinicius? I have told thee, O Lord, that he deifies thee. All the more may he be certain of permission. That is a comely maiden, but too narrow in the hips. The Augusta Poppaea has complained to me that she enchanted our child in the gardens of the Palatine. But I told Tigellinus that the gods are not subject to evil charms. Thou rememberest, divinity, his confusion and thy exclamation, Habet. I remember. Here he turned to Vinicius. Dost thou love her, as Petronius says? I love her, Lord, replied Vinicius. Then I command thee to set out for Rome tomorrow, and marry her. Appear not again before my eyes without the marriage ring. Thanks to thee, Lord, from my heart and soul. Oh, "How pleasant it is to make people happy," said Nero. "Would that I might do nothing else all my life." "Grant us one favor more, O divinity," said Petronius. "Declare thy will in this matter before the Augusta." Vinicius would never venture to wed a woman displeasing to the Augusta. "Thou wilt dissipate her prejudice, O Lord, with a word, by declaring that thou hast commanded this marriage." "I am willing," said Caesar. "I could refuse nothing to thee or Vinicius." He turned toward the villa, and they followed. Their hearts were filled with delight over the victory, and Vinicius had to use self-restraint to avoid throwing himself on the neck of Petronius, for it seemed now that all dangers and obstacles were removed. In the atrium of the villa young Nerva and Tullius Seneca were entertaining the Augusta with conversation. Terpnos and Diodorus were tuning there. Nero entered, sat in an armchair inlaid with tortoiseshell, whispered something in the ear of a Greek slave near his side, and waited. The page returned soon with a golden casket. Nero opened it and took out a necklace of great opals. "These are jewels worthy of this evening," said he. "The light of aurora is plain in them," answered Poppaea, convinced that the necklace was for her. Caesar, now raising, now lowering the rosy stones, said at last, "Vinicius, thou wilt give, from me, this necklace to her whom I command thee to marry, the youthful daughter of the Lygian king." Poppaea's glance, filled with anger and sudden amazement, passed from Caesar to Vinicius. At last it rested on Petronius. But he, leaning carelessly over the arm of the chair, passed his hand along the back of the harp as if to fix its form firmly in his mind. Vinicius gave thanks for the gift, approached Petronius, and asked, "How shall I thank thee for what thou hast done this day for me?" "Sacrifice a pair of swans to Euterpe," replied Petronius, "praise Caesar's songs, and laugh at omens. Henceforth the roaring of lions will not disturb thy sleep, I trust, nor that of thy Lygian lily." "No," said Vinicius, "now I am perfectly at rest." "May fortune favor thee. But be careful, for Caesar is taking his lute again." "Hold thy breath, listen, and shed tears." In fact Caesar had taken the lute and raised his eyes. In the hall conversation had stopped, and people were as still as if petrified. Terpnos and Diodorus, who had to accompany Caesar, were on the alert, looking now at each other and now at his lips, waiting for the first tones of the song. Just then a movement and noise began in the entrance, and after a moment Caesar's freedman, Fan, appeared from beyond the curtain. Close behind him was the consul Licanius. Nero frowned. "Pardon, divine imperator," said Fan, with panting voice, "there is a conflagration in Rome. The greater part of the city is in flames." At this news all sprang from their seats. "O gods! I shall see a burning city and finish the Troad," said Nero, setting aside his lute. Then he turned to the consul. "If I go at once, shall I see the fire?" "Lord," answered Licanius, as pale as a wall, "the whole city is one sea of flame, smoke is suffocating the inhabitants, and people faint, or cast themselves into the fire from delirium. Rome is perishing, Lord." A moment of silence followed, which was broken by the cry of Vinicius, "Vi misero mihi!" And the young man, casting his toga aside, rushed forth in his tunic. Nero raised his hands and exclaimed, "Woe to thee, sacred city of Priam!" Chapter 42. Vinicius had barely time to command a few slaves to follow him. Then, springing on his horse, he rushed forth in the deep night along the empty streets toward Laurentum. Through the influence of the dreadful news he had fallen as it were into frenzy and mental distraction. At moments he did not know clearly what was happening in his mind. He had merely the feeling that misfortune was on the horse with him, sitting behind his shoulders, and shouting in his ears, "Rome is burning!" That it was lashing his horse and him, urging them toward the fire. Laying his bare head on the beast's neck, he rushed on, in his single tunic, alone, at random, not looking ahead, and taking no note of obstacles against which he might perchance dash himself. In silence and in that calm night, the rider and the horse, covered with gleams of the moon, seemed like dream visions. The Idumean stallion, dropping his ears and stretching his neck, shot on like an arrow past the motionless cypresses and the white villas hidden among them. The sound of hoofs on the stone flags roused dogs here and there. These followed the strange vision with their barking. Afterward, excited by its suddenness, they fell to howling, and raised their jaws toward the moon. The slaves hastening after Vinicius soon dropped behind, as their horses were greatly inferior. When he had rushed like a storm through sleeping Laurentum, he turned toward Ardea, in which, as in Aricia, Beauville, and Ustrinum, he had kept relays of horses from the day of his coming to Antium, so as to pass in the shortest time possible the interval between Rome and him. Remembering these relays, he forced all the strength from his horse. Beyond Ardea it seemed to him that the sky on the northeast was covered with a rosy reflection. That might be the dawn, for the hour was late, and in July daybreak came early. But Vinicius could not keep down a cry of rage and despair, for it seemed to him that that was the glare of the conflagration. He remembered the consul's words, "The whole city is one sea of flame," and for a while he felt that madness was threatening him really, for he had lost utterly all hope that he could save Lygia, or even reach the city before it was turned into one heap of ashes. His thoughts were quicker now than the rush of the stallion. They flew on ahead like a flock of birds, black, monstrous, and rousing despair. He knew not, it is true, in what part of the city the fire had begun, but he supposed that the Trans-Tiber division, as it was packed with tenements, timber yards, storehouses, and wooden sheds serving as slave marts, might have become the first food of the flames. In Rome fires happened frequently enough. During these fires, as frequently, deeds of violence and robbery were committed, especially in the parts occupied by a needy and half-barbarous population. What might happen, therefore, in a place like the Trans-Tiber, which was the retreat of a rabble collected from all parts of the earth? Here the thought of Ursus with his preterhuman power flashed into Vinicius's head. But what could be done by man, even were he a titan, against the destructive force of fire? The fear of servile rebellion was like a nightmare, which had stifled Rome for whole years. It was said that hundreds of thousands of those people were thinking of the times of Spartacus, and merely waiting for a favorable moment to seize arms against their oppressors and Rome. Now the moment had come. Perhaps war and slaughter were raging in the city together with fire. It was possible even that the praetorians had hurled themselves on the city, and were slaughtering at command of Caesar. In that moment the hair rose from terror on his head. He recalled all the conversations about burning cities, which for some time had been repeated at Caesar's court with wonderful persistence. He recalled Caesar's complaints that he was forced to describe a burning city without having seen a real fire, his contemptuous answer to Tigellinus, who offered to burn Antium or an artificial wooden city. Finally, his complaints against Rome, and the pestilential alleys of the Suburra. Yes, Caesar has commanded the burning of the city. He alone could give such a command, as Tigellinus alone could accomplish it. But if Rome is burning at command of Caesar, who can be sure that the population will not be slaughtered at his command also? The monster is capable even of such a deed. Conflagration, a servile revolt, and slaughter. What a horrible chaos! What a letting loose of destructive elements and popular frenzy! And in all this is Lygia. The groans of Vinicius were mingled with the snorting and groans of his horse. The beast, running on a road which rose continually toward Aricia, was using the last of its breath. Who will snatch her from the burning city? Who can save her? Here Vinicius, stretching himself entirely on the horse, thrust his fingers into his own hair, ready to gnaw the beast's neck from pain. At that moment a horseman, rushing also like a whirlwind, but in the opposite direction, toward Antium, shouted as he raced past, "Rome is perishing!" And on he went. To the ears of Vinicius came only one more expression, "Gods." The rest was drowned by the thunder of hooves. But that expression sobered him. Gods. Vinicius raised his head suddenly, and, stretching his arms toward the sky filled with stars, began to pray. "Not to you do I call whose temples are burning, but to thee. Thou thyself hast suffered. Thou alone art merciful. Thou alone hast understood people's pain. Thou didst come to this world to teach pity to mankind, then show it now. If thou art what Peter and Paul declare, save for me Lygia, take her in thy arms. Bear her out of the flames. Thou hast the power to do that. Give her to me, and I will give thee my blood. But if thou art unwilling to do this for me, do it for her. She loves thee and trusts in thee. Thou dost promise life and happiness after death, but happiness after death will not pass away, and she does not wish to die yet. Let her live. Take her in thy arms. Bear her out of Rome. Thou canst do so, unless thou art unwilling." And he stopped, for he felt that further prayer might turn to a threat. He feared to offend divinity at the moment when he needed favor and mercy most. He was terrified at the very thought of that, and, so as not to admit to his head a shade even of threat, he began to lash his horse again, especially since the white walls of Aricia, which lay midway to Rome, gleamed up before him in the moonlight. After a time he rushed at full speed past the Temple of Mercury, which stood in a grove before the city. Evidently people knew of the catastrophe, for there was an uncommon movement in front of the temple. While passing, Vinicius saw crowds on the steps and between the columns. These people holding torches were hastening to put themselves under protection of the deity. Moreover, the road was not so empty or free as beyond Ardea. Crowds were hurrying, it is true, to the grove by side paths, but on the main road were groups which pushed aside hurriedly before the onrushing horsemen. From the town came the sound of voices. Vinicius rode into Aricia like a whirlwind, overturning and trampling a number of persons on the way. He was surrounded by shouts of "Rome is burning! Rome is on fire! May the gods rescue Rome!" The horse stumbled, but, reined in by a powerful hand, rose on his haunches before the inn, where Vinicius had another beast in relay. Slaves, as if waiting for the arrival of their master, stood before the inn, and at his command ran one before the other to lead out a fresh horse. Vinicius, seeing a detachment of 10 mounted praetorians, going evidently with news from the city to Antium, sprang toward them. "What part of the city is on fire?" inquired he. "Who art thou?" asked the decurion. "Vinicius, a tribune of the army, an Augustine." "Answer on thy head." "The fire broke out in the shops near the Circus Maximus. When we were dispatched, the center of the city was on fire." "And the Transtiber?" "The fire has not reached the Transtiber yet, but it is seizing new parts every moment with a force which nothing can stop. People are perishing from heat and smoke. All rescue is impossible." At this moment they brought the fresh horse. The young tribune sprang to his back and rushed on. He was riding now toward Albinum, leaving Alba Longa and its splendid lake on the right. The road from Aricia lay at the foot of the mountain, which hid the horizon completely, and Albinum lying on the other side of it. But Vinicius knew that on reaching the top he should see, not only Boval and Ustrinum, where fresh horses were ready for him, but Rome as well, for beyond Albinum the low-level Campania stretched on both sides of the Appian Way, along which only the arches of the aqueducts ran toward the city, and nothing obstructed the view. "From the top I shall see the flames," said he, and he began to lash his horse anew. But before he had reached the top of the mountain he felt the wind on his face, and with it came the odor of smoke to his nostrils. At the same time the summit of the height was becoming gilded. "The fire," thought Vinicius. The night had paled long since, the dawn had passed into light, and on all the nearer summits golden and rosy gleams were shining, which might come either from burning Rome or the rising daylight. Vinicius touched the summit at last, and then a terrible sight struck his eyes. The whole lower region was covered with smoke, forming as it were one gigantic cloud lying close to the earth. In this cloud towns, aqueducts, villas, trees, disappeared, but beyond this grey ghastly plain the city was burning on the hills. The conflagration had not the form of a pillar of fire, as happens when a single building is burning, even one of the greatest size. That was a long belt, rather, shaped like the belt of dawn. Above this belt rose a wave of smoke, in places entirely black, in places looking rose-colored, in places like blood, in places turning in on itself, in some places inflated, in others squeezed and squirming, like a serpent which is unwinding and extending. That monstrous wave seemed at times to cover even the belt of fire, which became then as narrow as a ribbon, but later this ribbon illuminated the smoke from beneath, changing its lower rolls into waves of flame. The two extended from one side of the sky to the other, hiding its lower part, as at times a stretch of forest hides the horizon. The Sabine hills were not visible in the least. To Vinicius it seemed at the first glance of the eye that not only the city was burning, but the whole world, and that no living being could save itself from that ocean of flame and smoke. The wind blew with growing strength from the region of the fire, bringing the smell of burnt things and of smoke, which began to hide even near objects. Clear daylight had come, and the sun lighted up the summits surrounding the Alban lake. But the bright golden rays of the morning appeared as it were reddish and sickly through the haze. Vinicius, while descending toward Albinum, entered smoke which was denser, less and less transparent. The town itself was buried in it thoroughly. The alarmed citizens had moved out to the street. It was a terror to think of what might be in Rome, when it was difficult to breathe in Albinum. Despair seized Vinicius anew, and terror began to raise the hair on his head. But he tried to fortify himself as best he might. It is impossible, thought he, that a city should begin to burn in all places at once. The wind is blowing from the north and bears smoke in this direction only. On the other side there is none. But in every case it will be enough for Ursus to go through the Janiculum gate with Lygia, to save himself and her. It is equally impossible that a whole population should perish, and the world-ruling city be swept from the face of the earth with its inhabitants. Even in captured places, where fire and slaughter rage together, some people survive in all cases. Why, then, should Lygia perish of a certainty? On the contrary, God watches over her, he who himself conquered death. Thus reasoning, he began to pray again, and, yielding to fixed habit, he made great vows to Christ, with promises of gifts and sacrifices. After he had hurried through Albinum, nearly all of whose inhabitants were on roofs and on trees to look at Rome, he grew somewhat calm, and regained his cool blood. He remembered, too, that Lygia was protected not only by Ursus and Linus, but by the Apostle Peter. At the mere remembrance of this, fresh solace entered his heart. For him Peter was an incomprehensible, an almost superhuman being. From the time when he heard him at Ostrionum, a wonderful impression clung to him, touching which he had written to Lygia at the beginning of his stay in Antium, that every word of the old man was true, or would show its truth hereafter. The nearer acquaintance which during his illness he had formed with the apostle heightened the impression, which was turned afterward into fixed faith. Since Peter had blessed his love and promised him Lygia, Lygia could not perish in the flames. The city might burn, but no spark from the fire would fall on her garments. Under the influence of a sleepless night, mad riding, and impressions, a wonderful exaltation possessed the young tribune. In this exaltation all things seemed possible. Peter speaks to the flame, opens it with a word, and they pass uninjured through an alley of fire. Moreover, Peter saw future events. Hence, beyond doubt, he foresaw the fire, and in that ease how could he fail to warn and lead forth the Christians from the city, and among others Lygia, whom he loved, as he might his own child. And a hope, which was strengthening every moment, entered the heart of Vinicius. If they were fleeing from the city, he might find them in Beauville, or meet them on the road. The beloved face might appear any moment from out the smoke, which was stretching more widely over all the Campania. This seemed to him more likely, since he met increasing numbers of people, who had deserted the city and were going to the Alban hills. They had escaped the fire, and wished to go beyond the line of smoke. Before he had reached Eustrinum he had to slacken his pace because of the throng. Besides pedestrians with bundles on their backs, he met horses with packs, mules and vehicles laden with effects, and finally litters in which slaves were bearing the wealthier citizens. Eustrinum was so thronged with fugitives from Rome that it was difficult to push through the crowd. On the market square, under temple porticos, and on the streets were swarms of fugitives. Here and there people were erecting tents under which whole families were to find shelter. Others settled down under the naked sky, shouting, calling on the gods, or cursing the fates. In the general terror it was difficult to inquire about anything. People to whom Vinicius applied either did not answer, or with eyes half bewildered from terror answered that the city and the world were perishing. New crowds of men, women, and children arrived from the direction of Rome every moment. These increased the disorder and outcry. Some, gone astray in the throng, sought desperately those whom they had lost. Others fought for a camping place. Half-wild shepherds from the Campania crowded to the town to hear news, or find profit and plunder made easy by the uproar. Here and there crowds of slaves of every nationality and gladiators fell to robbing houses and villas in the town, and to fighting with the soldiers who appeared in defense of the citizens. Unius, a senator, whom Vinicius saw at the inn surrounded by a detachment of Batavian slaves, was the first to give more detailed news of the conflagration. The fire had begun at the Circus Maximus, in the part which touches the Palatine and the Celian Hill, but extended with incomprehensible rapidity and seized the whole center of the city. Never since the time of Brennus had such an awful catastrophe come upon Rome. The entire circus has burned, as well as the shops and houses surrounding it, said Unius, The Aventine and Celian hills are on fire. The flames surrounding the Palatine have reached the Carina. Here Unius, who possessed on the Carina a magnificent insula, filled with works of art which he loved, seized a handful of foul dust, and, scattering it on his head, began to groan despairingly. But Vinicius shook him by the shoulder. "My house too is on the Carina," said he, "but when everything is perishing, let it perish also." Then recollecting that at his advice Lygia might have gone to the house of Aulus, he inquired, "But the Vicus Patricius?" "On fire," replied Unius. "The Trans-Tiber?" Unius looked at him with amazement. "Never mind the Trans-Tiber," said he, pressing his aching temples with his palms. "The Trans-Tiber is more important to me than all other parts of Rome," cried Vinicius, with vehemence. "The way is through the Via Portuensis, near the Aventine, but the heat will stifle thee." "The Trans-Tiber? I know not." "The fire had not reached it, but whether it is not there at this moment the gods alone know." Here Unius hesitated a moment, then said in a low voice, "I know that thou wilt not betray me, so I will tell thee that this is no common fire." People were not permitted to save the circus. When houses began to burn in every direction, I myself heard thousands of voices exclaiming, "Death to those who save!" Certain people ran through the city and hurled burning torches into buildings. On the other hand, people are revolting, and crying that the city is burning at command. I can say nothing more. Woe to the city, woe to us all, and to me. The tongue of man cannot tell what is happening there. People are perishing in flames or slaying one another in the throng. This is the end of Rome. And again he fell to repeating, "Woe, woe to the city and to us." Vinicius sprang to his horse, and hurried forward along the Appian Way. But now it was rather a struggling through the midst of a river of people and vehicles, which was flowing from the city. The city, embraced by a monstrous conflagration, lay before Vinicius as a thing on the palm of his hand. From the sea of fire and smoke came a terrible heat, and the uproar of people could not drown the roar and the hissing of flames. Chapter 43. As Vinicius approached the walls, he found it easier to reach Rome than penetrate to the middle of the city. It was difficult to push along the Appian Way, because of the throng of people. Houses, fields, cemeteries, gardens, and temples, lying on both sides of it, were turned into camping places. In the Temple of Mars, which stood near the Porta Appia, the crowd had thrown down the doors, so as to find a refuge within during night hours. In the cemeteries the larger monuments were seized, and battles fought in defense of them, which were carried to bloodshed. Ustrinum with its disorder gave barely a slight foretaste of that which was happening beneath the walls of the Capitol. All regard for the dignity of law, for family ties, for difference of position, had ceased. Gladiators drunk with wine seized in the Emporium gathered in crowds, ran with wild shouts through the neighboring squares, scattering, trampling, and robbing the people. A multitude of barbarians, exposed for sale in the city, escaped from the booths. For them the burning and ruin of Rome was at once the end of slavery and the hour of revenge, so that when the permanent inhabitants, who had lost all they owned in the fire, stretched their hands to the gods in despair, calling for rescue, these slaves with howls of delight scattered the crowds, dragged clothing from people's backs, and bore away the younger women. They were joined by slaves serving in the city from of old, wretches who had nothing on their bodies save woolen girdles around their hips, dreadful figures from the alleys, who were hardly ever seen on the streets in the daytime, and whose existence in Rome it was difficult to suspect. Men of this wild and unrestrained crowd, Asiatics, Africans, Greeks, Thracians, Germans, Britons, howling in every language of the earth, raged, thinking that the hour had come in which they were free to reward themselves for years of misery and suffering. In the midst of that surging throng of humanity, in the glitter of day and of fire, shone the helmets of praetorians, under whose protection the more peaceable population had taken refuge, and who in hand-to-hand battle had to meet the raging multitude in many places. Vinicius had seen captured cities, but never had his eyes beheld a spectacle in which despair, tears, pain, groans, wild delight, madness, rage, and license were mingled together in such immeasurable chaos. Above this heaving, mad human multitude roared the fire, surging up to the hilltops of the greatest city on earth, sending into the whirling throng its fiery breath, and covering it with smoke, through which it was impossible to see the blue sky. The young tribune with supreme effort, and exposing his life every moment, forced his way at last to the Appian Gate, but there he saw that he could not reach the city through the division of the Porta Capena, not merely because of the throng, but also because of the terrible heat from which the whole atmosphere was quivering inside the gate. Besides, the bridge at the Porta Trigenia, opposite the Temple of the Bonadi, did not exist yet, hence whoso wished to go beyond the Tiber had to push through to the Pons Sublicius, that is, to pass around the Aventine through a part of the city covered now with one sea of flame. That was an impossibility. Vinicius understood that he must return toward Ustrinum, turn from the Appian Way, cross the river below the city, and go to the Via Portuensis, which led straight to the Trans-Tiber. That was not easy because of the increasing disorder on the Appian Way. He must open a passage for himself there, even with the sword. Vinicius had no weapons. He had left Antium just as the news of the fire had reached him in Caesar's villa. At the Fountain of Mercury, however, he saw a centurion who was known to him. This man, at the head of a few tens of soldiers, was defending the precinct of the temple. He commanded him to follow. Recognizing a tribune and an Augustan, the centurion did not dare to disobey the order. Vinicius took command of the detachment himself, and, forgetting for that moment the teaching of Paul touching love for one's neighbor, he pressed and cut the throng in front with a haste that was fatal to many who could not push aside in season. He and his men were followed by curses and a shower of stones, but to these he gave no heed, caring only to reach freer spaces at the earliest. Still he advanced with the greatest effort. People who had encamped would not move, and heaped loud curses on Caesar and the praetorians. The throng assumed in places a threatening aspect. Vinicius heard voices accusing Nero of burning the city. He and Poppaea were threatened with death. Shouts of Sanio, Histrio, buffoon, actor, matricide, were heard round about. Some shouted to drag him to the Tiber, others that Rome had shown patience enough. It was clear that were a leader found, these threats could be changed into open rebellion which might break out any moment. Meanwhile the rage and despair of the crowd turned against the praetorians, who for another reason could not make their way out of the crowd. The road was blocked by piles of goods, borne from the fire previously, boxes, barrels of provisions, furniture the most costly, vessels, infants' cradles, beds, carts, hand-packs. Here and there they fought hand to hand, but the praetorians conquered the weaponless multitude easily. After they had ridden with difficulty across the Via Latina, Numitia, Ardea, Lavinia, and Ostia, and passed around villas, gardens, cemeteries, and temples, Vinicius reached at last a village called Vicus Alexandri, beyond which he crossed the Tiber. There was more open space at this spot, and less smoke. From fugitives, of whom there was no lack even there, he learned that only certain alleys of the Trans-Tiber were burning, but that surely nothing could resist the fury of the conflagration, since people were spreading the fire purposely, and permitted no one to quench it, declaring that they acted at command. The young tribune had not the least doubt then that Caesar had given command to burn Rome, and the vengeance which people demanded seemed to him just and proper. What more could Mithridates or any of Rome's most inveterate enemies have done? The measure had been exceeded. His madness had grown to be too enormous, and the existence of people too difficult because of him. Vinicius believed that Nero's hour had struck, that those ruins into which the city was falling should and must overwhelm the monstrous buffoon together with all those crimes of his. Should a man be found of courage sufficient to stand at the head of the despairing people, that might happen in a few hours. Here vengeful and daring thoughts began to fly through his head. But if he should do that? The house of Vinicius, which till recent times counted a whole series of consuls, was known throughout Rome. The crowds needed only a name. Once, when 400 slaves of the prefect Pedanius Secundus were sentenced, Rome reached the verge of rebellion and civil war. What would happen today in view of a dreadful calamity surpassing almost everything which Rome had undergone in the course of 8 centuries? Whoso calls the Quirites to arms, thought Vinicius, will overthrow Nero undoubtedly, and clothe himself in purple. And why should he not do this? He was firmer, more active, younger than other Augustines. True, Nero commanded 30 legions stationed on the borders of the empire, But would not those legions and their leaders rise up at news of the burning of Rome and its temples? And in that case Vinicius might become Caesar. It was even whispered among the Augustines that a soothsayer had predicted the purple to Otho. In what way was he inferior to Otho? Perhaps Christ himself would assist him with his divine power. Maybe that inspiration was his? Oh, would that it were! Exclaimed Vinicius, in spirit. He would take vengeance on Nero for the danger of Lygia and his own fear. He would begin the reign of truth and justice. He would extend Christ's religion from the Euphrates to the misty shores of Britain. He would array Lygia in the purple, and make her mistress of the world. But these thoughts which had burst forth in his head like a bunch of sparks from a blazing house, died away like sparks. First of all was the need to save Lygia. He looked now on the catastrophe from nearby, hence fear seized him again, and before that sea of flame and smoke, before the touch of dreadful reality, that confidence with which he believed that Peter would rescue Lygia died in his heart altogether. Despair seized him a second time when he had come out on the Via Portuensis, which led directly to the Trans-Tiber. He did not recover till he came to the gate, where people repeated what fugitives had said before, that the greater part of that division of the city was not seized by the flames yet, but that fire had crossed the river in a number of places. Still the Trans-Tiber was full of smoke, and crowds of fugitives made it more difficult to reach the interior of the place, since people, having more time there, had saved greater quantities of goods. The main street itself was in many parts filled completely, and around the Naumachia Augusta great heaps were piled up. Narrow alleys, in which smoke had collected more densely, were simply impassable. The inhabitants were fleeing in thousands. On the way Vinicius saw wonderful sights. More than once 2 rivers of people, flowing in opposite directions, met in a narrow passage, stopped each other. Men fought hand to hand, struck and trampled one another. Families lost one another in the uproar. Mothers called on their children despairingly. The young tribune's hair stood on end at thought of what must happen nearer the fire. Amid shouts and howls it was difficult to inquire about anything or understand what was said. At times new columns of smoke from beyond the river rolled toward them, smoke black and so heavy that it moved near the ground, hiding houses, people, and every object, just as night does. But the wind caused by the conflagration blew it away again. And then Vinicius pushed forward farther toward the alley in which stood the house of Linus. The fervor of a July day, increased by the heat of the burning parts of the city, became unendurable. Smoke pained the eyes, breath failed in men's breasts. Even the inhabitants who, hoping that the fire would not cross the river, had remained in their houses so far, began to leave them, and the throng increased hourly. The praetorians accompanying Vinicius remained in the rear. In the crush someone wounded his horse with a hammer. The beast threw up its bloody head, reared, and refused obedience. The crowd recognized in Vinicius an Augustan by his rich tunic, and at once cries were raised round about, "Death to Nero and his incendiaries!" This was a moment of terrible danger. Hundreds of hands were stretched toward Vinicius, but his frightened horse bore him away, trampling people as he went, and the next moment a new wave of black smoke rolled in and filled the street with darkness. Vinicius, seeing that he could not ride past, sprang to the earth and rushed forward on foot, slipping along walls, and at times waiting till the fleeing multitude passed him. He said to himself in spirit that these were vain efforts. Lygia might not be in the city, she might have saved herself by flight. It was easier to find a pin on the seashore than her in the crowd and chaos. Still he wished to reach the house of Linus, even at the cost of his own life. At times he stopped and rubbed his eyes. Tearing off the edge of his tunic, he covered his nose and mouth with it and ran on. As he approached the river, the heat increased terribly. Vinicius, knowing that the fire had begun at the Circus Maximus, thought at first that that heat came from its cinders and from the Forum Baurum and the Velabrum, which, situated nearby, must be also in flames. But the heat was growing unendurable. One old man on crutches and fleeing, the last whom Vinicius noticed, cried, "Go not near the bridge of Cestius. The whole island is on fire." It was, indeed, impossible to be deceived any longer. At the turn toward the Vicus Judaeorum, on which stood the house of Linus, the young tribune saw flames amid clouds of smoke. Not only the island was burning, but the Trans-Tiber, or at least the other end of the street on which Lygia dwelt. Vinicius remembered that the house of Linus was surrounded by a garden, Between the garden and the Tiber was an unoccupied field of no great size. This thought consoled him. The fire might stop at the vacant place. In that hope he ran forward, though every breeze brought not only smoke, but sparks in thousands, which might raise a fire at the other end of the alley and cut off his return. At last he saw through the smoky curtained cypresses in Linus's garden. The houses beyond the unoccupied field were burning already like piles of fuel, but Linus's little insula stood untouched yet. Vinicius glanced heavenward with thankfulness, and sprang toward the house though the very air began to burn him. The door was closed, but he pushed it open and rushed in. There was not a living soul in the garden, and the house seemed quite empty. "Perhaps they have fainted from smoke and heat," thought Vinicius. He began to call, Lygia, Lygia. Silence answered him. Nothing could be heard in the stillness there save the roar of the distant fire. Lygia. Suddenly his ear was struck by that gloomy sound which he had heard before in that garden. Evidently the vivarium near the temple of Aesculapius, on the neighboring island, had caught fire. In this vivarium every kind of wild beast, and among others lions, began to roar from affright. A shiver ran through Vinicius from foot to head. Now, a second time, at a moment when his whole being was concentrated in Lygia, these terrible voices answered, as a herald of misfortune, as a marvelous prophecy of an ominous future. But this was a brief impression, for the thunder of the flames, more terrible yet than the roaring of wild beasts, commanded him to think of something else. Lygia did not answer his calls, but she might be in a faint or stifled in that threatened building. Vinicius sprang to the interior. The little atrium was empty, and dark with smoke. Feeling for the door which led to the sleeping rooms, he saw the gleaming flame of a small lamp, and approaching it saw the lorarium in which was a cross instead of Lares. Under the cross a taper was burning. Through the head of the young catechumen, the thought passed with lightning speed that cross sent him the taper with which he could find Lygia. Hence he took the taper and searched for the sleeping rooms. He found one, pushed aside the curtains, and, holding the taper, looked around. There was no one there, either. Vinicius was sure that he had found Lygia's sleeping room, for her clothing was on nails in the wall, and on the bed lay a capitium, or close garment worn by women next the body. Vinicius seized that, pressed it to his lips, and taking it on his arm went farther. The house was small, so that he examined every room, and even the cellar quickly. Nowhere could he find a living soul. It was evident that Lygia, Linus, and Ursus, with other inhabitants of that part, must have sought safety in flight. "I must seek them among the crowd beyond the gates of the city," thought Vinicius. He was not astonished greatly at not meeting them on the Via Portuensis, for they might have left the Trans-Tiber through the opposite side along the Vatican Hill. In every case they were safe from fire at least. A stone fell from his breast. He saw, it is true, the terrible danger with which the flight was connected, but he was comforted at thought of the preterhuman strength of Ursus. "I must flee now," said he, "and reach the gardens of Agrippina through the gardens of Domitius, where I shall find them. The smoke is not so terrible there, since the wind blows from the Sabine hill." The hour had come now in which he must think of his own safety, for the river of fire was flowing nearer and nearer from the direction of the island, and rolls of smoke covered the alley almost completely. The taper, which had lighted him in the house, was quenched from the current of air. Vinicius rushed to the street, and ran at full speed toward the Via Portuensis, whence he had come. The fire seemed to pursue him with burning breath, now surrounding him with fresh clouds of smoke, now covering him with sparks, which fell on his hair, neck, and clothing. The tunic began to smolder on him in places. He cared not, but ran forward lest he might be stifled from smoke. He had the taste of soot and burning in his mouth. His throat and lungs were as if on fire. The blood rushed to his head, and at moments all things, even the smoke itself, seemed red to him. Then he thought, "This is living fire. Better cast myself on the ground and perish." The running tortured him more and more. His head, neck, and shoulders were streaming with sweat, which scalded like boiling water. Had it not been for Lygia's name, repeated by him in thought, had it not been for her capitium, which he wound across his mouth, he would have fallen. Some moments later he failed to recognize the street along which he ran. Consciousness was leaving him gradually. He remembered only that he must flee, for in the open field beyond waited Lygia, whom Peter had promised him. And all at once he was seized by a certain wonderful conviction, half feverish, like a vision before death, that he must see her, marry her, and then die. But he ran on as if drunk, staggering from one side of the street to the other. Meanwhile something changed in the monstrous conflagration which had embraced the giant city. Everything which till then had only glimmered, burst forth visibly into one sea of flame. The wind had ceased to bring smoke. That smoke which had collected in the streets was borne away by a mad whirl of heated air. That whirl drove with it millions of sparks, so that Vinicius was running in a fiery cloud as it were. But he was able to see before him all the better, and in a moment, almost when he was ready to fall, he saw the end of the street. That sight gave him fresh strength. Passing the corner, he found himself in a street which led to the Via Portuensis and the cutting field. The sparks ceased to drive him. He understood that if he could run to the Via Portuensis he was safe, even were he to faint on it. At the end of the street he saw again a cloud, as it seemed, which stopped the exit. If that is smoke, thought he, I cannot pass. He ran with the remnant of his strength. On the way he threw off his tunic, which, on fire from the sparks, was burning him like the shirt of Nessus, having only Lygia's capitium around his head and before his mouth. When he had run farther, he saw that what he had taken for smoke was dust, from which rose a multitude of cries and voices. The rabble are plundering houses, thought Vinicius. But he ran toward the voices. In every case people were there, they might assist him. In this hope he shouted for aid with all his might before he reached them. But this was his last effort. It grew redder still in his eyes, breath failed his lungs, strength failed his bones, he fell. They heard him, however, or rather saw him. Two men ran with gourds full of water. Vinicius, who had fallen from exhaustion but had not lost consciousness, seized a gourd with both hands, and emptied one half of it. Thanks, said he, place me on my feet, I can walk on alone. The other laborer poured water on his head. The two not only placed him on his feet, but raised him from the ground, and carried him to the others, who surrounded him and asked if he had suffered seriously. This tenderness astonished Vinicius. People, who are ye? Asked he. We are breaking down houses, so that the fire may not reach the Via Portuensis, answered one of the laborers. Ye came to my aid when I had fallen, thanks to you. We are not permitted to refuse aid, answered a number of voices. Vinicius, who from early morning had seen brutal crowds, slaying and robbing, looked with more attention on the faces around him, and said, May Christ reward you. Praise to his name, exclaimed a whole chorus of voices. Linus? Inquired Vinicius. But he could not finish the question or hear the answer, for he fainted from emotion and overexertion. He recovered only in the cutting field in a garden, surrounded by a number of men and women. The first words which he uttered were, Where is Linus? For a while there was no answer. Then some voice, known to Vinicius, said all at once, He went out by the Nomentan gate to Austrianum 2 days ago. Peace be with thee, O King of Persia. Vinicius rose to a sitting posture, and saw Shiloh before him. Thy house is burned surely, O Lord, said the Greek, for the Carina is in flames, but thou wilt be always as rich as Midas. Oh, what a misfortune! The Christians, O son of Serapis, have predicted this long time that fire would destroy the city. But Linus, with the daughter of Jove, is in Austrianum. Oh, what a misfortune for the city! Vinicius became weak again. Hast thou seen them? He inquired. I saw them, O Lord. May Christ and all the gods be thanked that I am able to pay for thy benefactions with good news. But, O Cyrus, I shall pay thee still more, I swear by this burning Rome. It was evening, but in the garden one could see as in daylight, for the conflagration had increased. It seemed that not single parts of the city were burning, but the whole city through the length and the breadth of it. The sky was red as far as the eye could see it, and that night in the world was a red night. Chapter 44. Light from the burning city filled the sky as far as human eye could reach. The moon rose large and full from behind the mountains, and inflamed at once by the glare took on the color of heated brass. It seemed to look with amazement on the world-ruling city which was perishing. In the rose-colored abysses of heaven rose-colored stars were glittering, but in distinction from usual nights the earth was brighter than the heavens. Rome, like a giant pile, illuminated the whole Campania. In the bloody light were seen distant mountains, towns, villas, temples, mountains, and the aqueducts stretching toward the city from all the adjacent hills. On the aqueducts were swarms of people, who had gathered there for safety or to gaze at the burning. Meanwhile the dreadful element was embracing new divisions of the city. It was impossible to doubt that criminal hands were spreading the fire, since new conflagrations were breaking out all the time in places remote from the principal fire. From the heights on which Rome was founded the flames flowed like waves of the sea into the valleys densely occupied by houses of 5 and 6 stories, full of shops, booths, movable wooden amphitheaters, built to accommodate various spectacles, and finally storehouses of wood, olives, grain, nuts, pine cones, the kernels of which nourished the more needy population, and clothing, which through Caesar's favor was distributed from time to time among the rabble huddled into narrow alleys. In those places the fire, finding abundance of inflammable materials, became almost a series of explosions, and took possession of whole streets with unheard-of rapidity. People encamping outside the city, or standing on the aqueducts knew from the color of the flame what was burning. The furious power of the wind carried forth from the fiery gulf thousands and millions of burning shells of walnuts and almonds, which, shooting suddenly into the sky, like countless flocks of bright butterflies, burst with a crackling, or, driven by the wind, fell in other parts of the city, on aqueducts, and fields beyond Rome. All thought of rescue seemed out of place. Confusion increased every moment, for on one side the population of the city was fleeing through every gate to places outside, on the other the fire had lured in thousands of people from the neighborhood, such as dwellers in small towns, peasants, and half-wild shepherds of the Campagna, brought in by hope of plunder. The shout, "Rome is perishing," did not leave the lips of the crowd. The ruin of the city seemed at that time to end every rule, and loosen all bonds which hitherto had joined people in a single integrity. The mob, in which slaves were more numerous, cared nothing for the lordship of Rome. Destruction of the city could only free them, hence here and there they assumed a threatening attitude. Violence and robbery were extending. It seemed that only the spectacle of the perishing city arrested attention, and restrained for the moment an outburst of slaughter, which would begin as soon as the city was turned into ruins. Hundreds of thousands of slaves, forgetting that Rome, besides temples and walls, possessed some tens of legions in all parts of the world, appeared merely waiting for a watchword and a leader. People began to mention the name of Spartacus, but Spartacus was not alive. Meanwhile citizens assembled, and armed themselves each with what he could. The most monstrous reports were current at all of the gates. Some declared that Vulcan, commanded by Jupiter, was destroying the city with fire from beneath the earth. Others that Vesta was taking vengeance for Rubria. People with these convictions did not care to save anything, but, besieging the temples, implored mercy of the gods. It was repeated most generally, however, that Caesar had given command to burn Rome, so as to free himself from odors which rose from the Suburra, and build a new city under the name of Neronia. Rage seized the populace at thought of this, and if, as Vinicius believed, a leader had taken advantage of that outburst of hatred, Nero's hour would have struck whole years before it did. It was said also that Caesar had gone mad, that he would command praetorians and gladiators to fall upon the people and make a general slaughter. Others swore by the gods that wild beasts had been let out of all the Vivaria at Bronzebeard's command. Men had seen on the streets lions with burning manes, and mad elephants and bisons, trampling down people in crowds. There was even some truth in this, for in certain places elephants, at sight of the approaching fire, had burst the Vivaria, and, gaining their freedom, rushed away from the fire in wild fright, destroying everything before them like a tempest. Public report estimated at tens of thousands the number of persons who had perished in the conflagration. In truth a great number had perished. There were people who, losing all their property, or those dearest their hearts, threw themselves willingly into the flames, from despair. Others were suffocated by smoke. In the middle of the city, between the Capitol, on one side, and the Quirinal, the Viminal, and the Esquiline on the other, as also between the Palatine and the Celian Hill, where the streets were most densely occupied, the fire began in so many places at once that whole crowds of people, while fleeing in one direction, struck unexpectedly on a new wall of fire in front of them, and died a dreadful death in a deluge of flame. In terror, in distraction, and bewilderment, People knew not where to flee. The streets were obstructed with goods, and in many narrow places were simply closed. Those who took refuge in those markets and squares of the city, where the Flavian amphitheater stood afterward, near the temple of the earth, near the portico of Silvia, and higher up, at the temples of Juno and Lucinia, between the Clivus Verbius and the old Esquiline gate, perished from heat, surrounded by a sea of fire. In places not reached by the flames were found afterward hundreds of bodies burned to a crisp, though here and there unfortunate store up flat stones and half buried themselves in defense against the heat. Hardly a family inhabiting the center of the city survived in full. Hence along the walls, at the gates, on all roads were heard howls of despairing women, calling on the dear names of those who had perished in the throng or the fire. And so, while some were imploring the gods, others blasphemed them because of this awful catastrophe. Old men were seen coming from the temple of Jupiter Liberator, stretching forth their hands, and crying, "If thou be a liberator, save thy altars and the city." But despair turned mainly against the old Roman gods, who, in the minds of the populace, were bound to watch over the city more carefully than others. They had proved themselves powerless, hence were insulted. On the other hand, it happened on the Via Asinaria that when a company of Egyptian priests appeared conducting a statue of Isis, which they had saved from the temple near the Portus Elemontana, a crowd of people rushed among the priests, attached themselves to the chariot, which they drew to the Appian gate, and seizing the statue placed it in the temple of Mars, overwhelming the priests of that deity who dared to resist them. In other places people invoked Serapis, Baal, or Jehovah, whose adherents, swarming out of the alleys in the neighborhood of the Subura and the Trans-Tiber, filled with shouts and uproar the fields near the walls. In their cries were heard tones as if of triumph. When, therefore, some of the citizens joined the chorus and glorified the Lord of the world, others, indignant at this glad shouting, strove to repress it by violence. Here and there hymns were heard, sung by men in the bloom of life, by old men, by women and children, hymns wonderful and solemn, whose meaning they understood not, but in which were repeated from moment to moment the words, "Behold, the judge cometh in the day of wrath and disaster." Thus this deluge of restless and sleepless people encircled the burning city, like a tempest-driven sea. But neither despair nor blasphemy nor hymn helped in any way. The destruction seemed as irresistible, perfect, and pitiless as predestination itself. Around Pompey's amphitheater stores of hemp caught fire, and ropes used in circuses, arenas, and every kind of machine at the games, and with them the adjoining buildings containing barrels of pitch with which ropes were smeared. In a few hours all that part of the city, beyond which lay the Campus Martius, was so lighted by bright yellow flames that for a time it seemed to the spectators, only half conscious from terror, that in the general ruin the order of night and day had been lost, and that they were looking at sunshine. But later a monstrous bloody gleam extinguished all other colors of flame. From the sea of fire shot up to the heated sky gigantic fountains, and pillars of flame spreading at their summits into fiery branches and feathers. Then the wind bore them away, turned them into golden threads, into hair, into sparks, and swept them on over the Campania toward the Alban hills. The night became brighter, the air itself seemed penetrated, not only with light, but with flame. The Tiber flowed on as living fire. The hapless city was turned into one pandemonium. The conflagration seized more and more space, took hills by storm, flooded level places, drowned valleys, raged, roared, and thundered. Chapter 45. Macrinus, a weaver, to whose house Vinicius was carried, washed him, and gave him clothing and food. When the young tribune had recovered his strength altogether, he declared that he would search further for Linus that very night. Macrinus, who was a Christian, confirmed Shiloh's report, that Linus, with Clement the chief priest, had gone to Ostrianum, where Peter was to baptize a whole company of confessors of the new faith. In that division of the city it was known to Christians that Linus had confided the care of his house 2 days before to a certain Gaius. For Vinicius this was a proof that neither Lygia nor Ursus had remained in the house, and that they also must have gone to Ostrianum. This thought gave him great comfort. Linus was an old man, for whom it would be difficult to walk daily to the distant Nomen gate, and back to the Trans-Tiber. Hence it was likely that he lodged those few days with some co-religionists beyond the walls, and with him also Ligia and Ursus. Thus they escaped the fire, which in general had not reached the other slope of the Esquiline. Vinicius saw in all this a dispensation of Christ, whose care he felt above him, and his heart was filled more than ever with love. He swore in his soul to pay with his whole life for those clear marks of favor. But all the more did he hurry to Austrianum. He would find Lygia, find Linus and Peter, he would take them to a distance, to some of his lands, even to Sicily. Let Rome burn, in a few days it would be a mere heap of ashes. Why remain in the face of disaster and a mad rabble? In his lands troops of obedient slaves would protect them, they would be surrounded by the calm of the country, and live in peace under Christ's wings blessed by Peter. Oh, if he could find them! That was no easy thing. Vinicius remembered the difficulty with which he had passed from the Appian Way to the Trans-Tiber, and how he must circle around to reach the Via Portuensis. He resolved, therefore, to go around the city this time in the opposite direction. Going by the Via Triumphatoris, it was possible to reach the Aemilian Bridge by going along the river, thence passing the Pincian Hill, all the Campus Martius, outside the gardens of Pompey, Lucullus, and Sallust, to make a push forward to the Via Nomentana. That was the shortest way, but Macrinus and Shiloh advised him not to take it. The fire had not touched that part of the city, it is true, but all the market squares and streets might be packed densely with people and their goods. Shiloh advised him to go through the Ager Vaticanus to the Porta Flaminia, cross the river at that point, and push on outside the walls beyond the gardens of Vasilius to the Porta Salaria. Vinicius, after a moment's hesitation, took this advice. Macrinus had to remain in care of his house, but he provided 2 mules, which would serve Ligia also in a further journey. He wished to give a slave, too, but Vinicius refused, judging that the first detachment of praetorians he met on the road would pass under his orders. Soon he and Shiloh moved on through the Pagus Janiculensis to the Triumphal Way. There were vehicles there, too, in open places, but they pushed between them with less difficulty, as the inhabitants had fled for the greater part by the Via Portuensis toward the sea. Beyond the Septimian Gate they rode between the river and the splendid gardens of Domitius. The mighty cypresses were red from the conflagration, as if from evening sunshine. The road became freer. At times they had to struggle merely with the current of incoming rustics. Vinicius urged his mule forward as much as possible, but Shiloh, riding closely in the rear, talked to himself almost the whole way. Well, we have left the fire behind, and now it is heating our shoulders. Never yet has there been so much light on this road in the night time. O Zeus, if thou wilt not send torrents of rain on that fire, thou hast no love for Rome. Surely the power of man will not quench those flames. Such a city which Greece and the whole world was serving. And now the first Greek who comes along may roast beans in its ashes. Who could have looked for this? And now there will be no longer a Rome, nor Roman rulers. Whoso wants to walk on the ashes, when they grow cold, and whistle over them, may whistle without danger. O gods, to whistle over such a world-ruling city. What Greek, or even barbarian, could have hoped for this? And still one may whistle, for a heap of ashes, whether left after a shepherd's fire or a burnt city, is mere ashes, which the wind will blow away sooner or later. Thus talking, he turned from moment to moment toward the conflagration, and looked at the waves of flame with a face filled at once with delight and malice. It will perish, continued he, and will never be on earth again. Whither will the world send its wheat now, its olives, and its money? Who will squeeze gold and tears from it? Marble does not burn, but it crumbles in fire. The Capitol will turn into dust, and the Palatine into dust. O Zeus! Rome was like a shepherd, and other nations like sheep. When the shepherd was hungry, he slaughtered a sheep, ate the flesh, and to thee, O Father of the gods, he made an offering of the skin. Who, O clown compeller, will do the slaughtering now, and into whose hand wilt thou put the shepherd's whip? For Rome is burning, O Father, as truly as if thou hadst fired it with thy thunderbolt. Hurry, urged Vinicius, what art thou doing there? I am weeping over Rome, Lord, Jove's city. For a time they rode on in silence, listening to the roar of the burning, and the sound of birds' wing, doves, a multitude of which had their nests about villas and in small towns of the Campania, and also every kind of field bird from near the sea and the surrounding mountains, mistaking evidently the gleam of the conflagration for sunlight, were flying, whole flocks of them, blindly into the fire. Vinicius broke the silence first. Where wert thou when the fire burst out? I was going to my friend Eurystheus, Lord, who kept a shop near the Circus Maximus, and I was just meditating on the teaching of Christ, when men began to shout, "Fire!" People gathered around the circus for safety, and through curiosity. But when the flames seized the whole circus, and began to appear in other places also, each had to think of his own safety. Didst thou see people throwing torches into houses? What have I not seen, O grandson of Aeneas? I saw people making a way for themselves through the crowd with swords. I have seen battles, the entrails of people trampled on the pavement. Ah, if thou hadst seen that, thou wouldst have thought that barbarians had captured the city, and were putting it to the sword. People round about cried that the end of the world had come. Some lost their heads altogether, and, forgetting to flee, waited stupidly till the flames seized them. Some fell into bewilderment, others howled in despair. I saw some also who howled from delight. O Lord, there are many bad people in the world who know not how to value the benefactions of your mild rule, and those just laws and virtue of which ye take from all what they have and give it to yourselves. People will not be reconciled to the will of God. Vinicius was too much occupied with his own thoughts to note the irony quivering in Shiloh's words. A shudder of terror seized him at the simple thought that Lygia might be in the midst of that chaos on those terrible streets where people's entrails were trampled on. Hence, though he had asked at least 10 times of Shiloh touching all which the old man could know, he turned to him once again. But hast thou seen them in Austrianum with thy own eyes? I saw them, O son of Venus. I saw the maiden, the good Lygian, holy Linus, and the apostle Peter. Before the fire? Before the fire, O Mithra. But a doubt rose in the soul of Vinicius whether Shiloh was not lying. Hence, reining his mule in, he looked threateningly at the old Greek and inquired, "What wert thou doing there?" Shiloh was confused. True, it seemed to him, as to many, that with the destruction of Rome would come the end also of Roman dominion. But he was face to face with Vinicius. He remembered that the young soldier had prohibited him, under a terrible threat, from watching the Christians, and especially Linus and Ligia. "Lord," said he, "why dost thou not believe that I love them?" "I do. I was in Austrianum, for I am half a Christian. Pyrrho has taught me to esteem virtue more than philosophy. Hence I cleave more and more to virtuous people. And, besides, I am poor, and when thou, O Jove, wert at Antium, I suffered hunger frequently over my books. Therefore I sat at the wall of Austrianum, for the Christians, though poor, distribute more alms than all other inhabitants of Rome taken together." This reason seemed sufficient to Vinicius, and he inquired less severely, "And dost thou not know where Linus is dwelling at this moment?" "Thou didst punish me sharply on a time for curiosity," replied the Greek. Vinicius ceased talking and rode on. "O Lord," said Shiloh, after a while, "thou wouldst not have found the maiden but for me, and if we find her now, thou wilt not forget the needy sage? Thou wilt receive a house with a vineyard at Amiriola, thanks to thee, O Hercules." "With a vineyard? Thanks to thee?" "Oh, yes, with a vineyard." They were passing the Vatican hill now, which was ruddy from the fire, but beyond the Naumachia they turned to the right, so that when they had passed the Vatican field they would reach the river, and, crossing it, go to the Flaminian Gate. Suddenly Shiloh reined in his mule, and said, "A good thought has come to my head, Lord." "Speak," answered Vinicius. "Between the Janiculum and the Vatican hill, beyond the gardens of Agrippina, are excavations from which stones and sand were taken to build the Circus of Nero." "Hear me, Lord." "Recently the Jews, of whom, as thou knowest, there is a multitude in Trans-Tiber, have begun to persecute Christians cruelly. Thou hast in mind that in the time of the divine Claudius there were such disturbances that Caesar was forced to expel them from Rome. Now, when they have returned, and when, thanks to the protection of the Augusta, they feel safe, they annoy Christians more insolently. I know this, I have seen it. No edict against Christians has been issued, but the Jews complain to the prefect of the city that Christians murder infants, worship an ass, and preach a religion not recognized by the Senate. They beat them, and attack their houses of prayer so fiercely that the Christians are forced to hide. "What dost thou wish to say?" inquired Vinicius. "This, Lord, that synagogues exist openly in the Trans-Tiber, but that Christians, in their wish to avoid persecution, are forced to pray in secret and assemble in ruined sheds outside the city or in sand pits. Those who dwell in the Trans-Tiber have chosen just that place which was excavated for the building of the circus and various houses along the Tiber. Now, when the city is perishing, the adherents of Christ are praying. Beyond doubt we shall find a countless number of them in the excavation, so my advice is to go in there along the road. But thou hast said that Linus has gone to Ostranium, cried Vinicius impatiently. But thou hast promised me a house with a vineyard at Miriola, answered Shiloh. For that reason I wish to seek the maiden wherever I hope to find her. They might have returned to the Trans-Tiber after the outbreak of the fire. They might have gone around outside the city, as we are doing at this moment. Linus has a house. Perhaps he wished to be nearer his house to see if the fire had seized that part of the city also. If they have returned, I swear to thee, by Persephone, that we shall find them at prayer in the excavation. In the worst event, we shall get tidings of them. Thou art right, lead on, said the tribune. Shiloh, without hesitation, turned to the left toward the hill. For a while the slope of the hill concealed the conflagration, so that, though the neighboring heights were in the light, the two men were in the shade. When they had passed the circus, they turned still to the left, and entered a kind of passage completely dark. But in that darkness Vinicius saw swarms of gleaming lanterns. They are there, said Shiloh. There will be more of them today than ever, for other houses of prayer are burnt or are filled with smoke, as is the whole Trans-Tiber. True, said Vinicius, I hear singing. In fact, the voices of people singing reached the hill from the dark opening, and the lanterns vanished in it one after the other. But from side passages new forms appeared continually, so that after some time Vinicius and Shiloh found themselves amid a whole assemblage of people. Shiloh slipped from his mule, and, beckoning to a youth who sat near, said to him, I am a priest of Christ and a bishop. Hold the mules for us, thou wilt receive my blessing and forgiveness of sins. Then, without waiting for an answer, he thrust the reins into his hands, and, in company with Vinicius, joined the advancing throng. They entered the excavation after a while, and pushed on through the dark passage by the dim light of lanterns till they reached a spacious cave, from which stone had been taken evidently, for the walls were formed of fresh fragments. It was brighter there than in the corridor, for, in addition to tapers and lanterns, torches were burning. By the light of these Vinicius saw a whole throng of kneeling people with upraised hands. He could not see Lygia, the Apostle Peter, or Linus, but he was surrounded by faces solemn and full of emotion. On some of them expectation or alarm was evident, on some, hope. Light was reflected in the whites of their upraised eyes, perspiration was flowing along their foreheads, pale as chalk. Some were singing hymns, others were repeating feverishly the name of Jesus, some were beating their breasts. It was apparent that they expected something uncommon at any moment. Meanwhile the hymn ceased, and above the assembly, in a niche formed by the removal of an immense stone, appeared Crispus, the acquaintance of Vinicius, with a face as it were half delirious, pale, stern, and fanatical. All eyes were turned to him, as though waiting for words of consolation and hope. After he had blessed the assembly, he began in hurried, almost shouting tones, Bewail your sins, for the hour has come. Behold, the Lord has sent down destroying flames on Babylon, on the city of profligacy and crime. The hour of judgment has struck, the hour of wrath and dissolution. The Lord has promised to come, and soon you will see him. He will not come as the Lamb, who offered his blood for your sins, but as an awful judge, who in his justice will hurl sinners and unbelievers into the pit. Woe to the world! Woe to sinners! There will be no mercy for them. I see thee, O Christ. Stars are falling to the earth in showers, the sun is darkened, the earth opens in yawning gulfs, the dead rise from their graves, but thou art moving amid the sound of trumpets and legions of angels, amid thunders and lightnings. I see thee, I hear thee, O Christ. Then he was silent, and, raising his eyes, seemed to gaze into something distant and dreadful. That moment a dull roar was heard in the cave, once, twice, a 10th time. In the burning city whole streets of partly consumed houses began to fall with a crash. But most Christians took those sounds as a visible sign that the dreadful hour was approaching. Belief in the early second coming of Christ and in the end of the world was universal among them. Now the destruction of the city had strengthened it. Terror seized the assembly. Many voices repeated, "The day of judgment. Behold, it is coming." Some covered their faces with their hands, believing that the earth would be shaken to its foundation, that beasts of hell would rush out through its openings and hurl themselves on sinners. Others cried, "Christ, have mercy on us. Redeemer, be pitiful." Some confessed their sins aloud. Others cast themselves into the arms of friends, so as to have some near heart with them in the hour of dismay. But there were faces which seemed rapt into heaven, faces with smiles not of earth. These showed no fear. In some places were heard voices. Those were of people who in religious excitement had begun to cry out unknown words and strange languages. Some person in a dark corner cried, "Wake thou that sleepest." Above all rose the shout of Crispus, "Watch ye, watch ye." At moments, however, silence came, as if all were holding the breath in their breasts, and waiting for what would come. And then was heard the distant thunder of parts of the city falling into ruins, after which were heard again groans and cries, "Renounce earthly riches, for soon there will be no earth beneath your feet. Renounce earthly loves, for the Lord will condemn those who love wife or child more than him. Woe to the one who loves the creature more than the Creator. Woe to the rich. Woe to the luxurious. Woe to the dissolute. Woe to husband, wife, and child." Suddenly a roar louder than any which had preceded shook the quarry. All fell to the earth, stretching their arms in cross form to ward away evil spirits by that figure. Silence followed, in which was heard only panting breath, whispers full of terror, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," and in places the weeping of children. At that moment a certain calm voice spoke above that prostrate multitude, "Peace be with you." That was the voice of Peter the Apostle, who had entered the cave a moment earlier. At the sound of his voice terror passed at once, as it passes from a flock in which the shepherd has appeared. People rose from the earth. Those who were nearer gathered at his knees, as if seeking protection under his wings. He stretched his hands over them and said, "Why are ye troubled in heart? Who of you can tell what will happen before the hour cometh? The Lord has punished Babylon with fire, but his mercy will be on those whom baptism has purified. And ye whose sins are redeemed by the blood of the Lamb will die with his name on your lips. Peace be with you." After the terrible and merciless words of Crispus, those of Peter fell like a bomb on all present. Instead of fear of God, the love of God took possession of their spirits. Those people found the Christ whom they had learned to love from the apostles' narratives, hence not a merciless judge, but a mild and patient Lamb, whose mercy surpasses man's wickedness 100-fold. A feeling of solace possessed the whole assembly, and comfort, with thankfulness to the apostle, filled their hearts. Voices from various sides began to cry, "We are thy sheep, feed us." Those nearer said, "Desert us not in the day of disaster." And they knelt at his knees, seeing which Vinicius approached, seized the edge of Peter's mantle, and, inclining, said, "Save me, Lord. I have sought her in the smoke of the burning and in the throng of people. Nowhere could I find her, but I believe that thou canst restore her." Peter placed his hand on the tribune's head. "Have trust," said he, "and come with me." Chapter 46. The city burned on. The Circus Maximus had fallen in ruins. Entire streets and alleys and parts which began to burn first were falling in turn. After every fall pillars of flame rose for a time to the very sky. The wind had changed, and blew now with mighty force from the sea, bearing toward the Celian, the Esquiline, and the Viminal rivers of flame, brands, and cinders. Still the authorities provided for rescue. At command of Tigellinus, who had hastened from Antium the third day before, houses on the Esquiline were torn down so that the fire, reaching empty spaces, died of itself. That was, however, undertaken solely to save a remnant of the city. To save that which was burning was not to be thought of. There was need also to guard against further results of the ruin. Incalculable wealth had perished in Rome. All the property of its citizens had vanished. Hundreds of thousands of people were wandering in utter want outside the walls. Hunger had begun to pinch this throng the second day, for the immense stores of provisions in the city had burned with it. In the universal disorder and in the destruction of authority no one had thought of furnishing new supplies. Only after the arrival of Tigellinus were proper orders sent to Ostia, but meanwhile the people had grown more threatening. The house at Aqua Appia, in which Tigellinus lodged for the moment, was surrounded by crowds of women, who from morning till late at night cried, "Bread and a roof." Vainly did praetorians, brought from the great camp between the Via Salaria and the Nomentana, strive to maintain order of some kind. Here and there they were met by open, armed resistance. In places weaponless crowds pointed to the burning city, and shouted, "Kill us in view of that fire." They abused Caesar, the Augustines, the praetorians. Excitement rose every moment, so that Tigellinus, looking at night on the thousands of fires around the city, said to himself that those were fires in hostile camps. Besides flour, as much baked bread as possible was brought at his command, not only from Ostia, but from all towns and neighboring villages. When the first installment came at night to the Emporium, the people broke the chief gate toward the Aventine, seized all supplies in the twinkle of an eye, and caused terrible disturbance. In the light of the conflagration they fought for loaves, and trampled many of them into the earth. Flour from torn bags whitened like snow the whole space from the granary to the arches of Drusus and Germanicus. The uproar continued till soldiers seized the building and dispersed the crowd with arrows and missiles. Never since the invasion by the Gauls under Brennus had Rome beheld such disaster. People in despair compared the two conflagrations. But in the time of Brennus the capital remained. Now the capital was encircled by a dreadful wreath of flame. The marbles, it is true, were not blazing, but at night, when the wind swept the flames aside for a moment, rows of columns in the lofty sanctuary of Jove were visible, red as glowing coals. In the days of Brennus, moreover, Rome had a disciplined integral people, attached to the city and its altars, but now crowds of a many-tongued populace roamed nomad-like around the walls of burning Rome, people composed for the greater part of slaves and freedmen, excited, disorderly, and ready, under the pressure of want, to turn against authority and the city. But the very immensity of the fire, which terrified every heart, disarmed the crowd in a certain measure. After the fire might come famine and disease, and to complete the misfortune the terrible heat of July had appeared. It was impossible to breathe air inflamed both by fire and the sun. Night brought no relief. On the contrary, it presented a hell. During daylight an awful and ominous spectacle met the eye. In the center a giant city on heights was turned into a roaring volcano. Round about as far as the Alban hills was one boundless camp, formed of sheds, tents, huts, vehicles, bales, packs, stands, fires, all covered with smoke and dust, lighted by sun rays reddened by passing through smoke, everything filled with roars, shouts, threats, hatred and terror. A monstrous swarm of men, women, and children. Mingled with Quirites were Greeks, shaggy men from the north with blue eyes, Africans, and Asiatics. Among citizens were slaves, freedmen, gladiators, merchants, mechanics, servants, and soldiers, a real sea of people, flowing around the island of fire. Various reports moved the sea as wind does a real one. These reports were favorable and unfavorable. People told of immense supplies of wheat and clothing to be brought to the Emporium and distributed gratis. It was said, too, that provinces in Asia and Africa would be stripped of their wealth at Caesar's command, and the treasures thus gained be given to the inhabitants of Rome, so that each man might build his own dwelling. But it was noised about also that water and the aqueducts had been poisoned, that Nero intended to annihilate the city, destroy the inhabitants to the last person, then move to Greece or to Egypt, and rule the world from a new place. Each report ran with lightning speed, and each found belief among the rabble, causing outbursts of hope, anger, terror, or rage. Finally a kind of fever mastered those nomadic thousands. The belief of Christians that the end of the world by fire was at hand, spread even among adherents of the gods, and extended daily. People fell into torpor or madness. In clouds lighted by the burning, gods were seen gazing down on the ruin. Hands were stretched toward those gods then to implore pity or send them curses. Meanwhile soldiers, aided by a certain number of inhabitants, continued to tear down houses on the Esquiline and the Celian, as also in the Trans-Tiber. These divisions were saved therefore in considerable part. But in the city itself were destroyed incalculable treasures accumulated through centuries of conquest, priceless works of art, splendid temples, the most precious monuments of Rome's past, and Rome's glory. They foresaw that of all Rome there would remain barely a few parts on the edges, and that hundreds of thousands of people would be without a roof. Some spread reports that the soldiers were tearing down houses not to stop the fire, but to prevent any part of the city from being saved. Tigellinus sent courier after courier to Antium, imploring Caesar in each letter to come and calm the despairing people with his presence. But Nero moved only when fire had seized the Domus Transitoria, and he hurried so as not to miss the moment in which the conflagration should be at its highest. Meanwhile fire had reached the Via Nomentana, but turned from it at once with a change of wind toward the Via Lata and the Tiber. It surrounded the capital, spread along the Forum Boarium, destroyed everything which it had spared before, and approached the Palatine a second time. Tigellinus, assembling all the praetorian forces, dispatched courier after courier to Caesar with an announcement that he would lose nothing of the grandeur of the spectacle, for the fire had increased. But Nero, who was on the road, wished to come at night, so as to sate himself all the better with a view of the perishing capital. Therefore he halted, in the neighborhood of Aqua Albana, and, summoning to his tent the tragedian Aliturus, decided with his aid on posture, look, and expression, learned fitting gestures, disputing with the actor stubbornly whether at the words "O sacred city," which seemed more enduring than Ida, he was to raise both hands, or, holding in one the formina, drop it by his side and raise only the other. This question seemed to him then more important than all others. Starting at last about nightfall, he took counsel of Petronius also whether to the lines describing the catastrophe he might add a few magnificent blasphemies against the gods, and whether, considered from the standpoint of art, they would not have rushed spontaneously from the mouth of a man in such a position, a man who was losing his birthplace. At length he approached the walls about midnight with his numerous court, composed of whole detachments of nobles, senators, knights, freedmen, slaves, women, and children. 16,000 praetorians, arranged in line of battle along the road, guarded the peace and safety of his entrance, and held the excited populace at a proper distance. The people cursed, shouted, and hissed on seeing the retinue, but dared not attack it. In many places, however, applause was given by the rabble, which, owning nothing, had lost nothing in the fire, and which hoped for a more bountiful distribution than usual of wheat, olives, clothing, and money. Finally, shouts, hissing, and applause were drowned in the blare of horns and trumpets, which Tigellinus had caused to be sounded. Nero, on arriving at the Ostian gate, halted, and said, "Houseless ruler of a houseless people, where shall I lay my unfortunate head for the night?" After he had passed the Clivus Delphini, he ascended the Appian Aqueduct on steps prepared purposely. After him followed the Augustines and a choir of singers, bearing stare, lutes, and other musical instruments. And all held a breath in their breasts, waiting to learn if he would say some great words, which for their own safety they ought to remember. But he stood solemn, silent, in a purple mantle, and a wreath of golden laurels, gazing at the raging might of the flames. When Terpnos gave him a golden lute, he raised his eyes to the sky, filled with the conflagration, as if he were waiting for inspiration. The people pointed at him from afar as he stood in the bloody gleam. In the distance fiery serpents were hissing. The ancient and most sacred edifices were in flames. The temple of Hercules, reared by Evander, was burning. The temple of Jupiter Stator was burning. The temple of Luna, built by Servius Tullius, the house of Numa Pompilius, the sanctuary of Vesta with the Penates of the Roman people. Through waving flames the capital appeared at intervals. The past and the spirit of Rome was burning. But he, Caesar, was there with a lute in his hand and a theatrical expression on his face, not thinking of his perishing country, but of his posture and the prophetic words with which he might describe best the greatness of the catastrophe, rouse most admiration, and receive the warmest plaudits. He detested that city, he detested its inhabitants, beloved only his own songs and verses. Hence he rejoiced in heart that at last he saw a tragedy like that which he was writing. The verse-maker was happy, the declaimer felt inspired, the seeker for emotions was delighted at the awful sight, and thought with rapture that even the destruction of Troy was as nothing if compared with the destruction of that giant city. What more could he desire? There was world-ruling Rome in flames, and he, standing on the arches of the aqueduct with a golden lute, conspicuous, purple, admired, magnificent, poetic. Down below, somewhere in the darkness, the people are muttering and storming. But let them mutter. Ages will pass, thousands of years will go by, but mankind will remember and glorify the poet, who in the night sang the fall and the burning of Troy. What was Homer compared with him? What Apollo himself with his hollowed-out lute? Here he raised his hands and, striking the strings, pronounced the words of Priam. O nest of my fathers, O dear cradle! His voice in the open air, with the roar of the conflagration, and the distant murmur of crowding thousands, seemed marvelously weak, uncertain, and low, and the sound of the accompaniment like the buzzing of insects. But senators, dignitaries, and Augustines, assembled on the aqueduct, bowed their heads and listened in silent rapture. He sang long, and his motive was ever sadder. At moments, when he stopped to catch breath, the chorus of singers repeated the last verse. Then Nero cast the tragic sirma, a robe with train, worn especially by tragic actors, from his shoulder with a gesture learned from Aliturus, struck the lute, and sang on. When at last he had finished the lines composed, he improvised, seeking grandiose comparisons in the spectacle unfolded before him. His face began to change. He was not moved, it is true, by the destruction of his country's capital, but he was delighted and moved with the pathos of his own words to such a degree that his eyes filled with tears on a sudden. At last he dropped the lute to his feet with a clatter, and, wrapping himself in the sirma, stood as if petrified, like one of those statues of Niobe which ornamented the courtyard of the Palatine. Soon a storm of applause broke the silence. But in a distance this was answered by the howling of multitudes. No one doubted then that Caesar had given command to burn the city, so as to afford himself a spectacle and sing a song at it. Nero, when he heard that cry from hundreds of thousands, turned to the Augustines with the sad, resigned smile of a man who is suffering from injustice. "See," said he, "how the Quirites value poetry and me." "Scoundrels," answered Vadinius, "command the praetorians, Lord, to fall on them." Nero turned to Tigellinus. "Can I count on the loyalty of the soldiers?" "Yes, divinity," answered the prefect. But Petronius shrugged his shoulders, and said, "On their loyalty, yes, but not on their numbers. Remain meanwhile where thou art, for here it is safest. But there is need to pacify the people." Seneca was of this opinion also, as was Lysinus the consul. Meanwhile the excitement below was increasing. The people were arming with stones, tent poles, sticks from the wagons, planks, and various pieces of iron. After a while some of the praetorian leaders came, declaring that the cohorts, pressed by the multitude, kept the line of battle with extreme difficulty, and, being without orders to attack, they knew not what to do. "O gods," said Nero, "what a night!" On one side a fire, on the other a raging sea of people. And he fell to seeking expressions the most splendid to describe the danger of the moment, but, seeing around him alarmed looks and pale faces, he was frightened, with the others. "Give me my dark mantle with a hood," cried he. "Must it come really to battle?" "Lord," said Tigellinus, in an uncertain voice, "I have done what I could, but danger is threatening." "Speak, O Lord, to the people, and make them promises." "Shall Caesar speak to the rabble?" "Let another do that in my name." "Who will undertake it?" "I," answered Petronius, calmly. "Go, my friend, thou art most faithful to me in every necessity. Go, and spare no promises." Petronius turned to the retinue with a careless, sarcastic expression. "Senators here present, also Piso, Nerva, and Seneca, follow me." Then he descended the aqueduct slowly. Those whom he had summoned followed, not without hesitation, but with a certain confidence which his calmness had given them. Petronius, halting at the foot of the arches, gave command to bring him a white horse, and, mounting, rode on, at the head of the cavalcade, between the deep ranks of praetorians, to the black, howling multitude. He was unarmed, having only a slender ivory cane which he carried habitually. When he had ridden up, he pushed his horse into the throng. All around, visible in the light of the burning, were upraised hands, armed with every manner of weapon, inflamed eyes, sweating faces, bellowing and foaming lips. A mad sea of people surrounded him and his attendants. Round about was a sea of heads, moving, roaring, dreadful. The outbursts increased and became an unearthly roar. Poles, forks, and even swords were brandished above Petronius. Grasping hands were stretched toward his horse's reins and toward him, but he rode farther, cool, indifferent, contemptuous. At moments he struck the most insolent heads with his cane, as if clearing a road for himself in an ordinary crowd, and that confidence of his, that calmness, amazed the raging rabble. They recognized him at length, and numerous voices began to shout, Petronius, arbiter elegantiarum, Petronius, Petronius, was heard on all sides. And as the name was repeated, the faces about became less terrible, the uproar less savage, for that exquisite patrician, though he had never striven for the favor of the populace, was still their favorite. He passed for a humane and magnanimous man, and his popularity had increased, especially since the affair of Pedanius Secundus, when he spoke in favor of mitigating the cruel sentence condemning all the slaves of that prefect to death. The slaves more especially loved him thenceforward with that unbounded love which the oppressed or unfortunate are accustomed to give those who show them even small sympathy. Besides, in that moment was added curiosity as to what Caesar's envoy would say, for no one doubted that Caesar had sent him. He removed his white toga, bordered with scarlet, raised it in the air, and waved it above his head, in sign that he wished to speak. "Silence! Silence!" cried the people on all sides. After a while there was silence. Then he straightened himself on the horse and said in a clear, firm voice, Citizens, let those who hear me repeat my words to those who are more distant, and bear yourselves, all of you, like men, not like beasts in the arena. We will. Then listen. The city will be rebuilt. The gardens of Lucullus, Maecenas, Caesar, and Agrippina will be open to you. Tomorrow will begin the distribution of wheat, wine, and olives, so that every man may be full to the throat. Then Caesar will have games for you, such as the world has not seen yet. During these games banquets and gifts will be given you. Ye will be richer after the fire than before it. A murmur answered him which spread from the center in every direction, as a wave rises on water in which a stone has been cast. Those nearer repeated his words to those more distant. Afterward were heard here and there shouts of anger or applause, which turned at length into one universal call of panem circenses. Petronius wrapped himself in his toga and listened for a time without moving, resembling in his white garment a marble statue. The uproar increased, drowned the roar of the fire, was answered from every side and from ever-increasing distances. But evidently the envoy had something to add, for he waited. Finally, commanding silence anew, he cried, I promised you panem circenses, and now give a shout in honor of Caesar, who feeds and clothes you. Then go to sleep, dear populace, for the dawn will begin before long. He turned his horse then, and, tapping lightly with his cane the heads and faces of those who stood in his way, he rode slowly to the praetorian ranks. Soon he was under the aqueduct. He found almost a panic above, where they had not understood the shout panem circenses, and supposed it to be a new outburst of rage. They had not even expected that Petronius would save himself, so Nero, when he saw him, ran to the steps, and with face pale from emotion, inquired, Well, what are they doing? Is there a battle? Petronius drew air into his lungs, breathed deeply, and answered, By Pollux, they are sweating. And such a stench, will someone give me an epilyma? For I am faint. Then he turned to Caesar. I promised them, said he, wheat, olives, the opening of the gardens, and games. They worship thee anew, and are howling in thy honor. Gods, what a foul odor those plebeians have! I had praetorians ready, cried Tigellinus, and hadst thou not quieted them, the shouters would have been silenced forever. It is a pity, Caesar, that thou didst not let me use force. Petronius looked at him, shrugged his shoulders, and added, The chance is not lost. Thou mayst have to use it tomorrow. No, cried Caesar, I will give command to open the gardens to them, and distribute wheat. Thanks to thee, Petronius, I will have games, and that song, which I sang today, I will sing publicly. Then he placed his hands on the arbiter's shoulder, was silent a moment, and starting up at last inquired, Tell me sincerely, how did I seem to thee while I was singing? Thou wert worthy of the spectacle, and the spectacle was worthy of thee, said Petronius. But let us look at it again, said he, turning to the fire, and bid farewell to ancient Rome.